The Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College has presented free talks for the public by best-selling authors and great thinkers on the college's Upper East Side campus.
Hi, hope you enjoy it.
Those of you who are writers know what I'm talking about. You have a little voice in your head drives you crazy.
We're dancing with words, prancing with words.
As a result of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and required social distancing, public gatherings such as our remaining 2 talks for the spring semester have unfortunately been canceled.
Thank goodness we've recorded it.
Center Director Louis Frumkes has had each of the talks recorded for archives and to provide a copy of the talk to the speaker on DVD.
We have some incredible scientists coming.
That the universe just began.
Given the need for intellectual stimulation during this troubling time, the Frumkes Center is making many of our past talks available to view for a limited time each week. Stay tuned to our website for more information about the videos available each week.
It is clear to me great hair conveys and connotes great power. Think Samson in the Bible, who was able to wrestle a lion to submission and defeat an entire army with the jawbone of an ass. Until, of course, he was shorn of his hair by Delilah. And then think Steven Pinker in our own time, who according to Time magazine is one of the 100 most influential people in the world today, even though they don't say it is because of his hair, but you and I know otherwise. So who is this lionized and lion-maned intellectual that attracts so much deserved attention and brings you here tonight? Well, he is the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, who has also taught at Stanford and MIT. His research on visual cognition and the psychology of language has won prizes from the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Institution of Great Britain, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society, and the American Psychological Association, among others. He has also received 6 honorary doctorates, several teaching awards, and numerous prizes for his books, The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, and his latest, The Stuff of Thought, Language as a Window into Human Nature, all of which I assume we will have back there later for him to inscribe to you if you wish to purchase them. Even though, to my knowledge, there is no ruling body for the English language, Stephen does serve as the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary. I could go on and on about Stephen, but that would leave less time for him to speak. Suffice that as befitting a man of his intelligence, Stephen selected for a wife, or perhaps she selected him. One of you can ask that question during Q&A. Not only a woman of great beauty and charm, but a woman of at least equal intelligence, a leading philosopher and novelist in the person of Rebecca Goldstein. Rebecca was a summa cum laude graduate of Barnard College, a MacArthur Fellow, a Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and a Guggenheim Fellow. Her novels include The Mind-Body Problem, The Late Summer Passion of a Woman of Mind, The Dark Sister, The Properties of Light, Properties of Light or Properties of Light, what of those? And 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction. I hope you are as thrilled as I am to welcome Stephen and Rebecca here this evening to kick off the Hunter Writing Center's 2012 Great Thinkers of Our Time series by talking about their latest work. Rebecca and Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louis. Pleasure. Rebecca and I have decided to take turns, and each of us is going to focus on a single theme that has animated our diverse work. Is the microphone on, by the way? No, it isn't.
It is if you speak. Hold it close. That's the problem.
Hold it close. Oh, I see. Okay. So each of us is going to present a theme that ties together our diverse work. In my case, the theme is human nature, a topic that I have explored from many angles and in a number of ways. I am a psychologist, and one might think that that means that I'm part of a field that studies human nature, but in fact for much of its history, psychology was averse to the notion that there's any such thing as human nature. For psychology was dominated by behaviorism, which not only denied that there was anything innate in the mind, but denied that there was any such thing as a mind. The only thing you were allowed to do was to correlate the organism's history of reinforcement and current stimulus situation with the probability of its emitting one kind of behavior or another. And that was still influential when I was an undergraduate, and I was, among my influences was the linguist Noam Chomsky, who is often credited with bringing down the behaviorist dogma by both introducing the idea that cognitive processes could be studied in terms of mentally represented rules and representations. You could think of them as mental computations, and the idea that the representations got there by means of abstract knowledge of the general form of language, what he called universal grammar. So obviously, none of us is born with English or Japanese or Yiddish or Swahili. On the other hand, we must be born with something, otherwise you couldn't explain why a child in the presence of jabbering adults ends up jabbering himself, whereas a house pet brought up in the same environment of jabbering adults doesn't end up talking. So the general idea that human nature can be studied both as a system of internal representations, internal information processing, and that the key to studying human nature scientifically is to identify some abstract formula, knowledge, schema, abstract specification, not merely as complete as what we obviously know and use as we live our lives, but rich enough to make learning possible. That's an idea that I think has animated much of my own thinking and research. I started off as a graduate student modern scientific study of language development in children, a field that is also very well represented here at Hunter College. My colleague Virginia Valian is a distinguished researcher here at Hunter, as is a former student of mine, Sandeep Prasada. My first work was in questions of acquisition of grammar and syntax, as is Professor Valian. And I wrote 2 books, which were not sold in stores, like the K-Tel Vegematic, but in this case, because they were pretty much only of interest to colleagues and students, fairly technical books on how children acquire language. I tried to propose a theory of language development in children, and then elaborated one component of that theory, namely how children learn the meaning and use of verbs. That might sound like a very narrow topic, but the verb is the part of the sentence that organizes all the other parts, kind of defines slots for the rest of the sentence to fit into, and so it is a major subcomponent of the problem of learning a language. And later on, I'll come back to that, because it turned out that I realized at the time that I was devoting my life to the semantics of verbs that it was actually of greater interest than just in technical linguistics, but that it, I later argued, held the key to understanding certain aspects of human nature. But in the interim, I studied another aspect of language in considerable detail, the difference between regular and irregular verbs. That is, verbs like bring, brought, or come, came, go, went, sit, sat, that form their past tense in idiosyncratic ways, and verbs like walk, walked, stay, stayed, play, played, and so on, which follow a perfectly predictable and monotonous rule, add ed to form the past tense. Now again, this may seem to fall in the great academic tradition of knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. But there was a reason for concentrating so much attention on what might seem like one minute phenomenon. No one ever got a grant for studying human nature. It's just too big a topic. And there has to be some tractable phenomenon that you can actually study. And the appeal of this little corner of language is that, for me, it encapsulated the two cognitive processes that make language possible in all its glory. One of them is memory, the part of the brain that we rely on when we learn our vocabulary. Each of us knows on the order of 50 to 100,000 words. Each of them is arbitrary as a phone number, an arbitrary pairing between a sound and a meaning. But the human memory is capacious enough to allow us to learn all these words, and irregular forms like bring, brought are just another 150 or so arbitrary forms to add to this an already enormous lexicon. Whereas regular forms like walk, walked don't have to be memorized, because a general purpose algorithm to form the past tense add ed, a mental operation or subroutine, can always crank out a new one whenever you need one, which is why when new words enter the language, to spam, to fax, to mosh, to dis, no one has to go to a dictionary to look up their past tense forms. They can instinctively know it's got to be mosh, moshed, fax, faxed, and so on. So these were otherwise nicely matched, both two ways of talking about something in the past, but they held the promise of isolating these two major components of the human cognitive computational mechanism. In the course of writing and teaching about language, I found that people who weren't linguists found the topic eternally fascinating. That even though I cringed when someone asked what I did for a living, and I said, well, I study irregular verbs, but then everyone had examples. They had jokes, they had wordplay, they had stories about their kids, stories about learning a foreign language, pet peeves about how people were abusing the language, curiosity as to why there are so many languages. And as a consumer of popular science books myself, I thought there was a need for a book that would introduce people to what the modern science of language had discovered about language. And my first book that was sold in stores was called The Language Instinct, How the Mind Creates Language, which was an overview of everything you always wanted to know about language, from how we know the size of a person's vocabulary, to how kids acquire language, to who decides what's correct or incorrect grammar, to how language evolved, to what are these theories of Noam Chomsky that people have heard of but just seem too recondite and abstract for anyone to understand, and I did my best to explain them as well. I also tried to tie together the picture of language with harking back to the idea that language is a window into human nature. That not only did I convey an idea also associated with Noam Chomsky that the mind is, that language is one of the faculties of the mind, that the human mind is not just just homogeneous spam. There isn't just one all-purpose learning mechanism that is responsible for everything we think, feel, see, and do and want, but that the mind has a structure, and that language is one of its components. And which raises the question, where did that component come from, and what are the other components? Where did it come from? Well, if there is some innate basis to a mental faculty, that means it had to have evolved. That's where innate things come from. And I related language to the view that one can only understand the human mind by understanding the purpose for which it was designed. Now, when I say purpose and design, I don't literally mean that the mind was designed by an engineer with a purpose, but in the same sense that we can say that the purpose of the heart is to pump blood, the purpose of the kidney is to filter blood. You can't understand parts of the body without asking questions about their function. The answer, of course, to where the parts of the body come from is that they evolved via the process of natural selection, Darwin's explanation for why there's an illusion of design in the living world. And I tried to apply that idea to where language came from and why it's organized the way it is. Namely, that language is an adaptation that allows our species to share thoughts and negotiate social relationships. Well, that led to another question. If language is one of our faculties, and if one of the things that makes us special is that we yak to each other, what are the other parts of the mind? And what else is special about Homo sapiens? And that led to a book called How the Mind Works, in which I talked about other components of mind, such as our ways of learning and understanding the physical world, our sense of number, our sense of living things, our sense of physical objects, our emotions like fear and anger and sympathy and gratitude, our aesthetic reactions, why music is pleasing, why landscapes are pleasing, why faces and bodies are pleasing, where sexuality comes from, all related to the idea that the different parts of the mind evolved as Darwinian adaptations, held together by the special niche that Homo sapiens fills in nature, namely the cognitive niche. What's special about our species is not just that we talk. We certainly wouldn't have evolved an ability to talk unless we had something to say, nor would we have evolved the ability unless we were on speaking terms with one another. And so our sociality, the fact that we cooperate with members of the species that are not our blood relatives, and our technological know-how, the fact that we live by our wits and our tools to a much greater degree than any other species, are what makes Homo sapiens special. How am I doing for time, Louis?
We're all right. It depends how much time you want to leave for Rebecca.
Well, I better shut up. Let me just, I'll say a sentence or two about a couple of other my activities before spending a minute or two on my most recent book. In 2002, I wrote a book called The Blank Slate on the fact that discussions of human nature are not just topics in psychology, but often arouse intense emotional and reactions, are thought to have great political and moral implications. Why do people get aroused by the thought that we might have innate motives toward jealousy or aggression or language, or that some of these may differ between men and women, that we're not simply blank slates written on by our parents and our culture. And so I explored the larger implications of human nature in The Blank Slate. And then in my most recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, I address a particular problem that popped up in the writing of The Blank Slate and in How the Mind Works. I didn't think of it as a problem, but many people do. And that is that despite the fact that I argue there is such a thing as human nature, it doesn't mean that we are robotically programmed with one set of behaviors that our species will always exhibit in every time and every place. We know that cultures differ from one another, and we know that within a culture there can be changes over time. In particular, the greatest fear, I suspect, of the idea that there is such a thing as human nature is that it dooms us to perpetual war and strife and conflict. And in The Blank Slate, I said this is a non sequitur, because even if there are parts of the brain that incline us toward aggression, there are also parts that inhibit us from aggression, and that actual behavior depends on which of these two subsets of the mind are more engaged by a culture at a given time. And as a matter of fact, not only can our behavior change over time, but it obviously has changed over time. We no longer burn heretics at the stake. We no longer break people on the wheel. We no longer engage in constant raiding and feuding, in which gangs of related men abduct women from neighboring villages in endless cycles of vendetta. Well, in the most recent book, I expanded on this set of observations by documenting the little-known fact that just about every measure of violence has been in decline. That if you plot homicides, if you plot tribal warfare, if you plot barbaric customs like slavery and torture, All of them might be at historic lows. Now those historic lows are not zero, but they are less than what they used to be. And I tried to explain these phenomena by appealing to human nature, to a complex human nature, one that has multiple parts that, as I mentioned, incline us toward violence, dominance, revenge, greed, sadism, and parts that inhibit us, self-control, empathy, a sense of fairness. And to my surprise, although it shouldn't have been a surprise, given our next speaker and the person to whom I'm married, perhaps the greatest of the forces that has tamed our aggressive instincts is reason, the subject matter of philosophy. And under Rebecca's influence in large part, I looked at some of the great thinkers in history who identified barbaric practices and why they were barbaric, and in fact changed the course of history. Their ideas, as we now say, went viral and influenced legislators and popular sensibilities, and many of the advances that we now take for granted, like that women aren't property, that African Americans aren't just fit for enslavement, that we shouldn't be in a state of constant war, originated in intellectual briefs from thinkers that then changed the course of history. And perhaps with that, I'll use that as a segue to some of the themes that have animated Rebecca's work in thinking.
Well, I'm going to start out by telling you what you really want to know, which is, how did we meet? And it was, of course, through our books. What had happened was Steven Pinker was in a fierce debate over evolutionary psychology with Stephen Jay Gould, who many of you probably remember, a very important paleontologist, somebody also at Harvard, and they were arguing. Steve, of course, is a great advocate of evolutionary psychology, and Stephen Jay Gould was very much against it for, mainly I would say, for political reasons. And they were arguing this issue out in the manner of good intellectuals in the pages of the New York Review of Books. And it was back and forth. And I was avidly following this, as many of us were. And I was very much on the side of this Stephen at the time. And in the middle of this, Steve Pinker published a book about his little friends, the irregular verbs. It was called Words and Rules, and I rushed out to get it, and I immediately turned to the index to look up Gould, because I thought he might have gotten in a few extra swipes. It was very fierce, if you remember. It was as those arguments in the New York Review of Books often are. And I didn't find Gould, but I found Goldstein, Rebecca. And I thought, well, it's a very common name. In fact, right now I'm going by Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, trying to, Newberger had been my maiden name. Anyway, I see Goldstein, Rebecca, and I thought, well, of course, it's a different Rebecca Goldstein. I have nothing to do with irregular verbs. But it was me. And Steven Pinker had quoted my use of an obscure, I had used an obscure past participle of, and I remember it well, the verb to stride. I had said, had stridden. And he quoted this, and it was from one of my extremely obscure works, and he must have been the only person in the world who read that book. And he not only, quoted this, but he said, some of our finest writers will always use the more obscure past participle because it's to keep it in circulation and it's more poetic. And it was like, It was amazing to me that I was there, and that he had quoted me, and that he had even complimented me. Well, anyway, that was just in case you think there's no romance in irregular verbs. It's been a real nerd relationship ever since. Anyway, I was trying to think of something, some kind of theme that has unified my works in the way that human nature has unified Steve's. And what I came up with was the distinction between objectivity and subjectivity. So actually, my relationship with this distinction goes all the way back to my childhood, although of course I didn't have the terminology in those days. I grew up in a very religious household, a very Orthodox Jewish household, and we were very, as Romney would say, we were severely Orthodox, and we kept the Sabbath, we kept Shabbos severely, which meant there was nothing for us to do, us kids to do on Shabbos. In fact, it's Shabbos now. The only thing we could do was read, and so every Friday afternoon before sundown, we were taken, as soon as we knew how to read, to the public library. We were extremely impoverished. My father was a cantor, and as Steve says, we were as poor as shul mice, as poor as mice. And we would get our books, our reading matter for the Sabbath. And I, one Friday, took out a book called Our Friend the Atom. And I don't remember, some of you may have read this book. It was a fantastic book. It was, I learned in this book, and I don't know, I had just gotten my library card, so I was young. And I learned that the world out there was nothing like the way it appeared in here. Out there, here we've got all these solid things, but they only seem solid. They're really composed of these invisible, itty-bitty, power-packed particles spinning around, and there were no colors out there, and there were no real smells out there. They were our friend, the atom. That's what was out there. And this just blew me away. My little world was rocked. It was, how can this be that the world out there is nothing the way it appears in here? Suddenly this split between objectivity and subjectivity opened up, and how do we know? How did these people get out there? And I learned there were these class of people, scientists, who somehow managed to get outside appearances and describe the way the world really was. And I just hoped that someday I would get to meet a scientist. I didn't, I was a little Orthodox girl. There was no hope of becoming a scientist. But maybe I would get to meet a scientist someday. And it was, that just began this kind of obsession with what's out there and what's in here, and how do we get outside of appearances to what's really out there, and that science was the key. Well, when I finally got to college, which was itself a bit of an effort given the family I came from, and I went to Barnard across town, and I started out thinking I would be a physicist. I wanted to be on more intimate terms with our friend the atom. That had blown me away. And I did start out studying physics, and I was a happy little physics major until and of course, actually in Barnard in those days, there was very little physics going on, so I had to go across the street and take most of my courses at Columbia. But I was pretty happy until I took a course on quantum mechanics. And then I discovered, and my professor was quite adamant about this, that according to quantum mechanics, there is no out there. The objective world doesn't exist, and I was extremely disappointed about this. The whole romance of science seemed to be crumbling before me. And I went to this professor and I spoke to him a great deal. I was a real pain. And he finally said to me, why don't you go speak to the philosophers? They're much more interested in this kind of question. His attitude was basically, just shut up and calculate. We have the formulas, just plug it in and don't ask what it all means. And if you're going to ask what it all means, go talk to the philosophers. And I did. I went to talk to a man named Sidney Morgenbesser. And he told me that I could continue to study physics, but that really I was a philosopher. And so I was a philosopher. And in fact, I discovered in philosophy that this distinction between objectivity, this is the heart and soul of philosophy. This is the kind of question that's constantly coming up, and you direct this question to every field of human thought, to morality, to our conduct. We all feel quite differently about what's right and wrong. Steve just spoke about the changes that we've gone through just in the history of our species, that there was a time in Western Europe when it was perfectly fine to own people. Certainly our attitudes towards women have changed. Our attitudes towards what's coming to people has changed. But when you ask the question, and who has it right? Is there some sort of objective truth of the matter here? Are we constantly discovering the truths of morality, or have we simply, for cultural reasons, changed our ideas about it? You're asking a question about subjectivity and objectivity directed toward human conduct. Or when you ask about mathematics, which was also a great interest of mine, mathematics is unlike all other fields because it's what we call a priori. It's you discover these things through pure reason. That's why mathematicians are so inexpensive. They're cheap. They're almost as cheap as philosophers. For universities to hire, they don't need observatories. They don't need laboratories. It's all the work. They carry the equipment in their cranium. And why is that? Because it's a priori. And once something's proved, it's proved, right? It's proved for all times. So what's going on here? How can we do this? How do we even have access to these kinds of truths? Well, maybe we're just making them up as we go along. Maybe it's a game. Maybe it's a higher form of chess, right? We just lay down the rules and then we stipulate the rules and then we try to derive what follows from those rules. Or maybe we're discovering atemporal, non-spatio, non-temporal truths about not this world, but an abstract world. That's a Platonic view of mathematics. So is it really subjective? Are we just making it up? Or is it objective? Once again, these are the philosophical questions, meta-mathematical questions that can be directed to mathematics. And there are questions about subjectivity, objectivity, and quantum mechanics too, or science. Are we discovering something objectively true or not? This kind of question about subjectivity, objectivity, this is really the heart and soul of philosophy. So Morgenbesser was right. This really was what I was interested in. And and then another question, which is what is this subjectivity? Subjectivity is, the way the world seems to me. If you're conscious, if you're a conscious being, then there are facts about what the world seems like to you. But these facts, where are they in the world? Do they derive, are they an aspect of the objective world, or do they constitute their own realm? Which is what Descartes said, that subjectivity and objectivity are two different realms, mind, body, dualism. So there you're actually confronting the subjectivity, objectivity question and asking the ontological implications of it. Ontological, you see, you slip into the jargon. Ontological, which just means questions about being. And all of these questions are very much about objectivity, subjectivity. So I decided, yes, that I was going to go into philosophy and went on to graduate school. And it actually ended up working on, I went to Princeton, I worked with a philosopher that I think you've had come to your NYU program, Tom Nagel, a man who wrote an article called What Is It Like to Be a Bat, which I just loved, and decided, yes, I'll work with him. And it was on an aspect of the mind-body problem, on the question of reductionism. Can subjectivity be reduced to an objective description? If you knew everything about somebody's mind, would you be able to deduce from that what is it like to be them? Would you know everything about their subjectivity? This is a question that has since come to be called the hard problem of consciousness. Anyway, I was doing that. How did I become a novelist? I'll tell you, it's not even quite clear to me how I became a novelist. I had never studied novels, but I loved novels. It was, in fact, my shameful little secret. I didn't think of fiction as serious. It was somewhat of an effort for me to given my background, to get myself to college, and not to speak of graduate school, and when I finally got there, I was not going to study anything as frivolous and fun as literature. So I never took a single English course, because I felt, why should I study something that gives me so much pleasure? How could it be serious? Not that physics and philosophy didn't give me pleasure, but not the sort of pleasure that I derive from literature. And I was in fact a little bit ashamed of it, how much time I spent reading Henry James rather than William James, for example. You know that, of course, we're brothers, one the philosopher and one the novelist. So, but I was constantly reading these things, never thinking I would ever write one. And then I was an assistant professor of philosophy at Barnard after I got my doctorate. And I actually gone through a very emotional time. It was my first year of teaching, or maybe my second. I lost my father, whom I love dearly, and I gave birth to my first child, and it put me in a kind of meta-philosophical mood. You know, philosophy is supposed to be the most meta of all fields because it's always going beyond. So you ask about math, what does it mean? Science, what does it mean? Contact, what does it mean? You're always, going above the field and asking these meta questions. Well, when I was going through this turmoil, it put me in a kind of meta-philosophical mood, and I was thinking, what? Here I am. I'm a philosopher that's supposed to connote some sort of wisdom. What did I learn by becoming a philosopher? And of course, I studied very technical things in philosophy. What did I learn about grief and love? And my conclusion was zilch, nothing. And in fact, I had been so intent on the more technical aspects of philosophy. I stayed very, very far away from things like existentialism, phenomenology. That was all mush as far as I was concerned. And so I felt, how much more do I know as a philosopher about these things than another, person of a comparable age? Probably less than the norm. Most women of, I guess I was 27 then, know. And so I started to think about this, and I thought, well, I'll try to write about this as a philosophy article. And I couldn't. It was too ill-defined and too messy. It's not the kind of thing that my training as a philosopher allowed me to write about. And I found myself writing a novel about it. The novel allowed me the freedom to throw off my first-class philosophical training and tolerate ambiguity and think about the emotional aspects of being a philosopher or of being a thinker in general. What does it feel like to be trying to think about objectivity all the time? What is it like to worship objectivity, for that to be a passion? And I ended up writing a book, and it was in the summer. I'd already written up my little journal article that was supposed to get me tenure, and I was so bored by it by that time, and I wrote this novel. It was called The Mind-Body Problem. And so it was about the sort of thing I studied, only, it had a plot and it had characters, and the conflicts that I felt were played out in the characters. And once again, I realize now, looking back, not only was this about my obsession with objectivity, subjectivity, and after all, the mind-body problem is all about that. How do we reconcile subjectivity with objectivity? But it was also about subjectivity very deeply, right? As novels are, as all fiction is. What is it when you're reading a novel, when you're identifying with a character, you are learning something about what it's like to be somebody who's not yourself. That's the great wonder of fiction, that it is as deep an exploration as physics is of objectivity. Literature is just as deep an exploration of subjectivity. So I was sort of going at this distinction from another direction. Well, I was scared to tell my colleagues that I had written a novel. I was, at that time, it's not much better now, but at that time, there were very few women in philosophy. There were no women in philosophy of science. And then you go and you write a novel, you might as well just put a sign on your head saying, I am not serious. Do not take me seriously. So I was afraid to tell anybody, but I thought it was pretty good. And I sort of asked a friend of a friend of a friend, so it would be untraceable, how do you publish these things? And they said, oh, you need a literary agent. How do you find these things? So I found a literary agent, and and it was published, and it was published by Random House, and it actually became a bestseller, which was not good for my philosophical career, I have to say. And I found this a very interesting way of balancing my philosophical life. And my interest in novels always, I still love to read novels, but my sort of novel, what I like to write in, I have to be interested when I write these novels. I have to inhabit these minds for a very long time, so they have to be very, very interesting minds to me. And so my characters tend to think about the things that I find very interesting. So they are often thinking about philosophy or math or physics. And the title of the novel that you were searching for there wasn't Properties of Life, but Properties of Light. It was called Properties of Light, a novel of love, betrayal, and quantum physics. So I got back to my quantum physics, and this is a novel. This was my fifth, or I don't remember which novel. I think my fifth novel. And it was about quantum physicists trying to give an objective interpretation, God damn it, of quantum mechanics, right? So, and there is, in fact, there are objective interpretations of quantum mechanics. So I tend to like to write novels about people who are passionate about ideas and to describe that's like. I think that's one of the great passions. Novelists like passion and they like conflict. And I think the life of the mind is filled with passion and filled with conflict. And I certainly feel that very strongly. And I think it's a ripe subject for novelists to exploit. I'll just quickly, time does go by when you're talking. I've also written some books that are nonfiction. I'll just tell you about I wrote about Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Gödel was one of the great mathematicians of the past 100 years, maybe the greatest. And he was really interested in the meta-mathematical questions. What is math about? And he wanted to prove something mathematically that would have philosophical implications, that would entail Platonism, a Platonist interpretation of mathematics, that math is, he loved objectivity too, just like me. He wanted to prove mathematically that math is about, is descriptive of an objective world. It's really about an out there, not the out there of empirical science, but of something transcendent, something eternal. And he produced these great theorems, the incompleteness theorems. He thought he had proved mathematical Platonism by doing that, but there's tremendous amount of controversy over what the theorems really mean. But what was so interesting to me, and I met Gödel very briefly when I was a graduate student, he was a famous recluse and kind of a loon at Princeton, at the Institute for Advanced Study, and he had, the thing that's so interesting me about him is that this great mathematical result about which there's tremendous controversy had come out of this passion about what is it all about, what is his field really all about. And then I wrote a book about Spinoza, another great thinker, man I adore, and that got me, when I published that book about Spinoza, Betraying Spinoza, the Renegade Jew Who Gave Us Modernity, got me into the whole debate that's going on now between science and religion, faith and reason. Something I feel very, very strongly about given my background, and I had embraced philosophy as a kind of part of my passion for philosophy was a reaction against my religious upbringing. And so this was but I still have a great love for the past that I came from, even though I broke with it. I'm conflicted about that too. And I thought, but I got pulled into this whole atheism debate because of the Spinoza book, and Spinoza's a patron saint of free thinkers everywhere. And I thought, somebody ought to write a novel about what's going on now. It's so fascinating from a philosophical point of view that these issues that we debate in philosophy classes and metaphysics classes, proofs for the existence of God and all of that, has become such an obsession in the public square that everybody's talking about. It's a political issue, and just what's going on right now, the birth control issue and the Catholic bishops. Somebody ought to write about what is going on right now, and somebody who has the following qualification: thinking exactly the way I do about absolutely everything. And that's how I came to write the last book that I wrote, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction. Anyway, thank you very much.
It's nice to be adorable and brilliant, isn't it? That was a wonderful, thank you very much. Wonderful talk by both of these thinkers, and I'm thrilled to have them as our so to speak, keynote lead-off speakers. And now, because I'm sure you'd like to look at their books and let them inscribe them, I'd like to ask them to come up. We actually have 2 mics, and maybe they will take a few questions, not too many, because it could go on for a long time. So come up, and I'll call for you, and you can ask. The gentleman who started first in the very back, and then the young student in the red shirt.
Hi. I plan on buying your book, so if I say something that you address in it, forgive me. But one might say that right now we live in the most peaceful epoch in history, that is in line with part of our human nature to treat each other kindly and whatnot. But I would say the mechanism behind that is perhaps advancement in technology. And on different levels, for example, nations' ability to develop strong armies to prevent warfare, and the accumulation of wealth for people to live complacent lives, and also the development of the security apparatus of the state. For example, if I shoot someone in Manhattan, I'll be caught on 20 cameras, and I'll go to jail for the rest of my life. So I think that's a large part of why, at least in the developed world, we see these like crime and things like that going down. But I also have to ask, what about on the periphery of the developed world, like in Africa or sweatshops in China and these other areas that don't benefit so directly from all the resources and things that we have here in America and Europe?
I do think that it is technology in the very broad sense of our institutions, not just our gadgets, but our laws, our practices, our norms, our customs, all of which are human creations and in large part products of reason that have allowed us to tame our better angels. It isn't security cameras per se, because the most massive part of the decline of homicide occurred between the Middle Ages and the modern period rather than in the last 10 or 20 years. But it is a version of that idea, namely, if you have a more or less disinterested third party, a judiciary, a government, a police force that adjudicates disputes, you tend to get fewer bodies than when you have the Corleones and their enemies engaged in endless vendettas and cycles of revenge. So third-party justice is one of the institutions which can be facilitated by certain technological developments like closed-circuit TV and DNA testing and so on, but the key innovation was outsourcing revenge to a disinterested third party. It's not clear whether the advance in military technology itself was a good thing because everyone was too terrified to attack their neighbors, or whether it was changes in how military technology is deployed, because certainly the fact that our weapons got better and better and more destructive probably made things worse for a long time, probably until 1945, when the world kind of thought the better of starting wars at the drop of a hat, and that's when you first see a reduction in the number of deaths in warfare. Paradoxically, just when the weapons were getting far more destructive than they had to be to deter invasions, even though conventional warfare was plenty deterrent to make the US and the USSR think twice about starting a war in Europe. Nuclear weapons were kind of yet another level of terror. With or without them, you see a real change in sensibilities after World War II. Many of the changes, as you point out, have been more dramatic in the democratic West than elsewhere in the world, but they are measurable in the rest of the world as well, unevenly. But just to take a concrete example, legalized slavery, which was the rule throughout the world. It was considered just the way that complex societies had to be run, were eliminated first in Northern Europe and in England, and then in the northern states, and then the southern states, and then Latin America. And it trickled all over the world until the last few countries that had slavery on their books, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Mauritania, finally got around to eliminating them in 1962 and 1980. Now that's kind of late, and so it shows that this progress has been uneven, but it eventually did sweep up the rest of the world. And in a lot of other humanitarian developments, you can see this trajectory more or less from Northern and Western Europe to the rest of the world. Likewise, deaths in war. There was a huge reduction in deaths in war in the democratic world starting after World War II. At the end of the Cold War, starting around 1990, the rest of the world showed a reduction in rate of death in warfare as well. We still see warfare and trafficking and autocracies in the developing world. But it used to be that we saw them everywhere in the world, and I suspect that the trend, which will eventually sweep over the rest of the world, will nibble away at those remaining forms of institutionalized violence as well. But yes, all of that is in the book.
The gentleman with the red shirt first. You, the student, yep. No, right here.
A red shirt. No necktie.
I'm sorry, I was looking over your head. That's fine. Hi, I'm Tyler Alterman, and I'm a cognitive science student in the City University of New York, so I'm a huge fan of your work, but there is one passage I get caught up on in your 1994 work, The Language Instinct, and that's that linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity are wrong, all wrong. And so I think linguistic determinism, the strong version of the Whorf hypothesis that language is determined, or thought is determined by language, is obviously false for a lot of good reasons, but linguistic determinism has shown a rise as of late, given the work of Daniel Casasanto in New York and Lyra Bardisky out at Stanford. And I think there's been quite a bit of compelling evidence. So I was wondering if that was still an issue you would be willing to go to the mat for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in a more recent book, The Stuff of Thought, I have a chapter on linguistic determinism where I look at all those cases one by one. I didn't look at, I didn't discuss Daniel Casasanto's experiments because at the time they hadn't been published, though I knew them very well because he was a former student of mine. But yeah, I think the claims are overblown, and so I go through them one by one in The Stuff of Thought, and I think there's some at best minor effects of language on thought. I think there are effects of culture on language and effects of culture on thought, but that correlation has often been, I think, distorted into causation, that it's the language that determines the thought and behavior as opposed to the cultural differences determining, on the one hand, the language and on the other hand, the behavior. But anyway, a longer discussion we can get into here, but chapter 3 of The Stuff of Thought is where I go into that.
Does anyone have a question for Rebecca? Yes.
I loved hearing you both. It was just fascinating. But I was thinking, there's so many ideas, and I was wondering if a formal religion or a spiritual path would be too limiting for your need to have free thinking, or is there something that you are involved with? And also, I just want to throw out Occupy Wall Street.
Yes. I often think that had I been born a boy, I may never have left the fold because it wasn't that I was any smarter than the people in my family. There are a lot of very brilliant minds in my family, but they're boys, and they got caught up in Talmudic study, which I probably would have loved because it's quite a bit like analytic philosophy, right? It's hair splitting, and it's counter examples and all argumentation, all the sorts of things. I was probably bred. I come from a long line of Talmudic scholars. I was probably bred. My DNA probably is encoded for this stuff, but I was a girl, and so I was actually not allowed to study this, and that really annoyed me tremendously. And so I wanted out, and I wanted to study what the guys were studying, which basically was physics and math. And so I don't know, but I think I could very easily have stayed within the fold had I been allowed to study all the good stuff.
Now the gentleman with this red shirt.
I knew the red shirt would pay off. I'm writing a history of violent crime in the United States. I'm a professor over at John Jay, so I was especially interested in your work. But I have to confess that this section on the 1960s wasn't completely persuasive to me, and I want to tell you why and hear your response. I found it hard to believe that just one generation of Americans could buck this, what did you call it, an 8th century trend toward less violence, the alias theory that you rely upon. And of course you give some reasons why this happened, and I read it carefully, and I've incorporated it actually in my own work. But I'm not totally persuaded, so my question to you is, are you persuaded still now that you've written it? And do you have any other thoughts on why it is that just this one generation would buck the trend? Or is this one of the sins of taking a long-term look at something? That is, when you look over the long view, the long run, don't you end up really ignoring a lot of what I called in my book the zigs and zags of progress? And of course, as I also said, a lot of people die and are maimed and hurt in those zigs and zags. So that's important too. All right, that was long-winded.
Yes. Well, here's the long-term trend is that in Europe, and indeed in 5 different regions of the United States, between the time that each of these 5 regions in Europe, 5 regions in the United States, between the time that they lived more or less in a state of decentralized anarchy, you got rates of homicide in the range of, say, from 30 to more than 100 per 100,000 per year. That came down with the consolidation of government in every one of those regions, partly because of the effect of a Leviathan, of Big Brother penalizing you for attacking your neighbor and therefore canceling out your anticipated gain. But obviously, Big Brother can't watch you around the clock, certainly not in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s when there was no effective security apparatus. So there have to have been knock-on effects of government on everyday behavior. And Norbert Elias, the sociologist that the gentleman referred to, came up with a theory of what those knock-on effects were. Namely, they led to an enhancement of self-control, repressing impulses. He didn't have data available to him. He worked from narrative descriptions of changes of life from the Middle Ages to the present, and also argued that a kind of what we might call a bourgeois mentality, that is, you get a job, you support your family, you cultivate dignity, self-restraint, propriety, saving for the future. That whole set of attitudes, once it was facilitated both by government and by commerce, that led to a behavioral change that led people to be less likely to erupt in impulsive violence, to stab each other over a trivial insult. So by the 20th century, in every European country, or Western European country at least, the rate went down from between 30 to more than 100 down to about 1 to 2 per 100,000 per year. In the United States, it never went down that far. It went down to about 4 by the 1950s per 100,000 per year, but still a dramatic decline. In the 1960s, in every Western country, the homicide rate went up. Now, it did not go back up to the levels of the Middle Ages. In the United States, it went up to a high of 10.2. In Western Europe, it went up to, depending on the country, to 2 or 3. So it more than doubled, but the original decline was on the order of a factor of 10 to 30 to 100, depending on the country and the region. So we have a partial reversal. It wasn't, whatever happened in the 60s did not bring the world back to the Middle Ages. Now the question is why. The obvious place to look would be in the usual, as the social scientists say, structural variables, income, inequality, demographics. There was a baby boom, so there are a lot more young people commit more crimes, but none of those figures can account for the magnitude of the 1960s crime increase. If it was just the 15 to 30-year-olds committing crimes at the same rate, but there were just more of them, that would have predicted a 15% increase in violent crime, but in fact it was more like 150%. And so the quantitative criminologists whose work I read kind of threw up their hands and said, well, all of our quantitative variables don't work. It must be something in the culture, this black box for them, the kind of things that sociologists and cultural historians study. So they kind of punted, and leaving a mystery, and it was a zig and a zag that I, in fact, did address myself to, but it wasn't, of course, a reversal, an utter reversal, but it was a bit of a backsliding. And it seemed to me that couldn't be a coincidence. So you ask, on the one hand, what brought rates of violence down from the Middle Ages to the present? And Elias had this theory: self-control, self-restraint, bourgeois values. What happened in the 1960s in the culture, which all the economists and sociologists say must hold the key to the answer? Well, I kind of lived through it, and so did you. And the answer was, this is when we all overthrew bourgeois conventions, self-restraint. It was do your own thing, let it all hang out. If it feels good, do it. Rejecting the idea of conformity to social norms. So you put these two together, and it seems to me to be a pretty plausible explanation. There's got to be a cultural change. What was the cultural change? It was the reverse of the cultural change that initially brought it down in the first place. You're right, you wouldn't expect the cultural change to be so big that it would undo 800 years of history, but then it didn't undo 800 years of history. It undid maybe 150 years of history. So that's the story.
Because these folks have been kind enough to travel down from Boston, Cambridge, to be here tonight, and they're exhausted, and I want to end the evening here and tell you that both Stephen and Rebecca will be signing books back there. You can ask them questions up there. Please enjoy some refreshments, and please come to some of our future events. Well, and I want to thank these two for what I think was a splendid evening. Thank you.